He was not looking for a home anymore. He was looking for the one person he never forgot. The frozen morning air of Colorado carried a silence so deep that even the falling snow seemed afraid to make a sound. Outside the Veterans Haven shelter in the small mountain town of Silver Creek, the world was covered in white. The old brick building stood beneath a pale gray sky, its windows glowing softly against the cold. Inside, veterans drank coffee, shared quiet conversations, and carried memories they rarely spoke about. But beyond the front steps, beneath the shadow of a wooden sign that read "Veterans Welcome Here," a German Shepherd K-9 took his final steps through the snow. His name was Ranger. At least, that was the name stitched into the faded harness around his chest. His dark sable coat was covered with frost, and each breath rose into the morning air like a fragile whisper. He had walked for miles. No one knew where he came from. No one knew how long he had been alone. But something inside him kept moving forward. Something told him he had one more promise to keep. The first person to see him was Emily Carter, a shelter coordinator who had spent the last 6 years helping veterans rebuild their lives. She was carrying a box of donated blankets when she noticed the strange shape near the entrance. At first, she thought it was an old coat left behind by someone passing through. Then she saw 2 amber eyes looking back at her. "Oh my God," she whispered. She slowly placed the box down and stepped closer. The German Shepherd did not growl. He did not pull away. He simply lowered his head and looked at the door of the shelter as if he had been waiting for someone to open it. Emily removed her jacket and wrapped it gently around him. "You made it here," she said softly. "You really made it." The dog closed his eyes for a moment, almost as if he understood. When the shelter veterinarian arrived, he examined Ranger carefully and noticed something unusual. This was not a stray. The way he responded to sounds, the way he watched every movement, the way he protected the old harness around his body. This was a military K-9, a dog who had once belonged to someone. Emily looked down at the worn leather harness. Most of the stitching had faded from years of weather and time, but one name remained visible. Daniel Whitmore. She froze. The name felt familiar. She walked back inside and searched through old veteran records connected to the shelter. After several minutes, she found a photograph from years earlier. A young Marine stood beside a German Shepherd wearing the same harness. The Marine had a serious expression, but his hand rested gently on the dog's shoulder. Under the photo was a simple note: Corporal Daniel Whitmore and K-9 Ranger. Missing after overseas deployment. Emily looked from the photograph to the dog resting near the heater. 7 years had passed. 7 years since anyone had heard anything about Ranger. 7 years since Daniel Whitmore had stopped talking about the partner who once walked beside him everywhere. Across town, in a small garage filled with the smell of oil and fresh-cut wood, Daniel Whitmore was repairing an old pickup truck when his phone rang. He was 36 years old, a former United States Marine with short brown hair, tired blue-gray eyes, and the quiet posture of someone who had learned to carry heavy memories without showing them. He lived simply. He worked with his hands. He kept his old uniform packed away in a closet. And on the top shelf of his bedroom sat one thing he never moved: a worn military photo of him and Ranger. Daniel answered the phone without expecting anything unusual. Then he heard Emily say the words that stopped time. "Mr. Whitmore, I think we found your dog." For a moment, there was only silence. The kind of silence that carries years of unanswered questions. Daniel looked toward the old photograph sitting across the room. His fingers tightened around the phone. "That's not possible," he whispered. "Ranger is gone." But Emily looked through the shelter window at the German Shepherd resting peacefully beside the heater. The dog lifted his head. His ears moved slightly. Somewhere deep inside him, he recognized a voice he had been waiting to hear for years. "I thought so too," Emily said. "But there is something you need to see." Outside, the snow continued falling over Silver Creek, the same snow that had covered Ranger's path, the same snow that had almost hidden him from the world. But some bonds are stronger than distance. Some promises survive longer than memory. And sometimes, the ones we think we have lost are simply finding their way home. Daniel Whitmore sat alone in his garage long after the phone call ended, listening to the quiet rhythm of the old heater struggling against the Colorado winter. The world outside continued moving. Cars passed along the street. Snow settled softly on rooftops. A neighbor's porch light flickered in the distance. But inside that small garage, time had stopped. For 7 years, Daniel had carried the same memory like a stone in his chest. A German shepherd running beside him through training fields. A loyal K-9 waiting by his side after long missions. A friend who never asked questions, never judged, and never walked away. Ranger was more than a working dog. He was the one constant in a life filled with change. Daniel looked at the photograph on his workbench. The young Marine in the picture looked different. His shoulders were straighter. His eyes were lighter. And beside him was a German shepherd with bright amber eyes and a harness that carried a name. Ranger. Daniel reached out and touched the edge of the photograph. "How could it be you?" he whispered. The question stayed in the air. Because deep down, a small part of him already knew the answer. Some connections are not erased by years. They simply wait for the right moment to return. The next morning, Daniel drove towards Silver Creek Veterans Haven before sunrise. The road stretched through snow-covered mountains, the kind of landscape that made every sound feel distant. The tires moved slowly over the icy pavement, and the windshield carried tiny drops of melting snow. Daniel kept both hands on the steering wheel. He had faced difficult moments before. He had walked into places where uncertainty was the only thing waiting. But this felt different. This was not a mission. This was a memory coming back to life. When he arrived at the shelter, Emily Carter was standing near the entrance. She had the same gentle expression she wore when she helped every veteran who walked through those doors. But this time, there was something different in her eyes. "Hope. He has been waiting," Emily said quietly. Daniel looked toward the room behind her. He could see the German shepherd resting near a warm blanket. Ranger looked older. His fur carried the marks of years spent outdoors. His movements were slower, but those eyes were the same. The moment Daniel stepped inside, the room became completely silent. Ranger lifted his head. At first, the dog did not move. He simply stared. 7 years of distance existed between them. 7 years of questions. 7 years of wondering. Daniel did not call his name. He did not rush forward. He only stood there, holding his breath. Then he whispered the one word that had followed him through every memory. "Ranger." The dog's ears slowly rose. His eyes widened. And for a moment, the shelter disappeared. There was no snow outside. No years apart. No empty spaces left behind. There was only recognition. Ranger pushed himself up carefully and took a few steps forward. Daniel lowered himself down, his hand open. The German shepherd stopped just inches away, breathing softly. He studied Daniel's face like he was reading a story he already knew by heart. Then he gently pressed his head against Daniel's hand. Daniel closed his eyes. A quiet emotion passed through him, the kind that words could not hold. "You remembered," he said softly. Ranger stayed close. Emily watched from across the room, understanding that she was witnessing something rare. Not a reunion between a man and a dog. Something deeper. A promise that had survived time. Later that afternoon, Emily explained everything she had learned. Ranger had been found wandering alone near a mountain road several days before arriving at the shelter. No identification tags remained. No owner information was available. Only the old harness had survived. The name had been almost impossible to read, but it was enough. Daniel ran his fingers over the worn leather. He noticed something he had never seen before. A small stitched patch hidden beneath the edge of the harness. It was faded, but the words were still visible. "Never. Leave your partner behind." Daniel looked down. Those words were familiar. They were not printed by a manufacturer. They were something he had written years ago during Ranger's training. A reminder he gave himself and his K-9 partner every single day. A promise. Emily watched his expression change. "You really believed he was gone, didn't you?" she asked. Daniel nodded slowly. "I did." He looked at Ranger resting beside him. "I thought I lost the last piece of that part of my life." The dog opened his eyes and looked back at him. And in that quiet moment, Daniel realized something. Maybe Ranger had not returned to remind him of the past. Maybe he had returned to help him finally move beyond it. Outside, snow continued falling over Silver Creek. But inside the shelter, warmth filled a place that had been cold for many years. Two souls that had been separated by time were sitting together again. And neither one needed an explanation. They already remembered. The morning after their reunion, Daniel Whitmore woke before the sun reached the mountains. For the first time in years, the silence inside his home did not feel empty. It felt peaceful. Outside his bedroom window, fresh snow covered the streets of Silver Creek, Colorado, turning the small town into a world of white and silver. Somewhere nearby, a truck started in the distance. A few birds moved between the bare branches of old trees. And inside the quiet house, a familiar sound filled the room. The soft breathing of a German shepherd resting on the floor beside the bed. Daniel opened his eyes and looked down. Ranger was there. Not as a memory. Not as a photograph. Not as a story he told himself when the nights became too long. He was real. The old K-9 lifted his head slightly, his amber eyes meeting Daniel's. For a moment, neither moved. They simply looked at each other. Because sometimes, after losing something for so long, even happiness feels impossible to believe. Daniel slowly reached down and placed his hand on Ranger's fur. The dog leaned closer, just like he used to years ago. That small movement carried more meaning than any words could explain. It was a reminder that some bonds do not disappear. They simply wait. Over the next several days, Daniel began bringing Ranger back into his daily routine. Their mornings became slower than they once were. There were no missions, no training schedules, no long roads ahead, just quiet walks through the neighborhood and afternoons sitting together near the fireplace. But Daniel noticed something about Ranger. The dog was still watching him the same way he always had. Not like a pet waiting for commands. Like a partner making sure his friend was okay. Emily Carter visited often from Silver Creek Veterans Haven. She had seen many veterans walk through those doors carrying invisible burdens. Some carried memories of places they never wanted to revisit. Others carried the weight of people they could not save. But Daniel was different after Ranger returned. He smiled more. He spoke more. He started telling stories again. One afternoon, Emily sat with him on the shelter porch while Ranger rested beside his feet. "I have seen people come here looking for a second chance," Emily said. "But I have never seen someone find one waiting for them." Daniel looked down at Ranger. The old K-9 had fallen asleep beneath the warm afternoon sun. "I thought I was the one who saved him," Daniel said quietly. "But maybe he was the one who saved me." The words stayed between them as the wind moved gently through the trees. A week later, Daniel decided to visit the old military training grounds where he and Ranger had spent so much time together. The place had changed. The fields were quieter now. The paths they once walked were covered with years of weather and memories. Daniel parked his truck and opened the door. Ranger stepped out slowly. His paws touched the ground, and for a moment, he looked around. There was something familiar in his expression. The scent of the earth, the sound of the wind, the feeling of a place where he once belonged. Daniel walked beside him. "You remember this place, don't you?" he whispered. Ranger looked back at him. The answer was clear. They walked along the old path together. Daniel remembered the younger version of himself. The Marine who believed strength meant never showing pain. The soldier who thought carrying everything alone was part of being brave. But Ranger had always known something Daniel had forgotten. Even the strongest people need someone beside them. Near an old wooden bench, Daniel stopped. He pulled a small box from his jacket pocket. Inside was a worn military patch from his early days of service. He had kept it for years, not because of what it represented, but because of who had been beside him. He placed the patch gently beside Ranger's harness. "You were always my partner," Daniel said. Ranger rested his head against Daniel's knee. The moment was quiet. No celebration. No crowd. No perfect ending. Just a man and a dog beneath a Colorado sky, remembering a promise that time could not erase. But Daniel did not know there was still more hidden inside Ranger's journey. The old harness that brought them back together carried another secret. A piece of the past that had waited patiently for someone to find it. And when Daniel finally discovered what was hidden there, he would understand that Ranger's return was not just a reunion. It was the final chapter of a promise that had never truly ended. The old harness rested on Daniel Whitmore's kitchen table beneath the warm glow of a small lamp. Outside, the Colorado evening settled quietly over Silver Creek. Snow covered the rooftops, and the distant mountains disappeared into a soft layer of fog. Inside the house, everything felt still, but Daniel could not look away from the worn leather sitting in front of him. For years, he had believed that harness was gone forever. He thought it had disappeared with the memories of a life he could never get back. Yet somehow, it had returned with Ranger. The same harness, the same name, the same silent promise. Daniel ran his fingers along the stitching, noticing the places where time had faded the material. He remembered a younger version of himself placing it around Ranger for the first time. Back then, the German shepherd was full of energy, always moving, always watching, always ready. Daniel smiled softly. You never stopped carrying it, did you? Ranger lifted his head from the floor and looked at him. The dog did not understand every word, but he understood the feeling behind them. The next morning, Daniel brought the harness to Emily Carter at Silver Creek Veterans Haven. The shelter had become more than a place where veterans found support. It had become the place where lost pieces of life sometimes found their way back. Emily examined the harness carefully under the bright lights near the front desk. She turned it over slowly, searching for anything unusual. There is something here, she said. Daniel stepped closer. Hidden beneath a folded section of leather was a small piece of fabric. It was carefully tucked away, protected from years of snow, rain, and time. Emily gently removed it and placed it on the table. It was a small patch of military material, faded but still recognizable. Daniel stared at it. His expression changed. He knew exactly what it was. It was not valuable because of the fabric. It was valuable because of the memory attached to it. Where did you get this? Emily asked. Daniel took a slow breath. I made it for him. The room became quiet. He explained that years earlier, before Ranger became his official K-9 partner, he had created a small reminder for their training days. Something simple. Something that represented trust. It carried the words they lived by. Never leave your partner behind. Daniel had always believed those words were meant for the battlefield. But now, sitting there with Ranger beside him, he understood they meant something much larger. They were about loyalty, about patience, about waiting for someone even when the world tells you they are gone. Emily looked at Ranger. He carried that all this time. Daniel nodded slowly. Or maybe he carried me. That afternoon, Daniel sat outside the shelter with Ranger resting beside him. The cold air moved gently through the trees, but the sun brought a little warmth to the quiet afternoon. Several veterans walked past and stopped to greet the old German shepherd. They noticed something special about him. Ranger had a calm presence, the kind that made people feel safe without needing to say anything. One veteran named Thomas Reed sat beside Daniel. He was a retired Marine who had spent many years helping others adjust. After service, he watched Ranger for a moment before speaking. You know what I think? Thomas said. Some people spend their whole lives looking for proof that they mattered. Daniel looked at him. Thomas smiled slightly. Maybe Ranger came back to remind you. Daniel looked down at the dog beside him. For years, he wondered if he had failed Ranger. He wondered if the last memory they shared was one of goodbye. But now he began to see something different. Maybe their story was never about losing each other. Maybe it was about finding each other when they both needed it most. That evening, Daniel returned home with Ranger walking slowly beside him. The old K-9 stopped near the doorway and looked back toward the road. For a brief moment, Daniel noticed something in his expression. A quiet alertness. A memory. As if Ranger knew there was still one more thing waiting to be discovered. The next morning, Daniel would receive a letter connected to Ranger's past. A message that had been hidden for years. And inside that message was a truth Daniel never expected to find. A truth that would finally explain how Ranger survived, why he kept searching, and who helped him continue the journey home. The letter arrived 3 days after Daniel Whitmore discovered the hidden patch inside Ranger's old harness. It was a simple envelope. No special markings. No urgent message. Just a name written carefully across the front. Daniel stood by the mailbox outside his home in Silver Creek, Colorado, feeling a strange weight in his hands. Some letters bring news. Others bring memories. But this one felt like it carried a piece of a life he thought was already finished. Ranger stood beside him, watching quietly. The old German shepherd's ears lifted slightly as Daniel opened the envelope. Inside was a single page and a small photograph. The handwriting belonged to someone Daniel recognized immediately. Sergeant Michael Lawson, a fellow Marine, a friend from a chapter of life that still lived in the corners of his mind. Daniel looked at the first line and felt his breath slow. Daniel, if you are reading this, then Ranger found his way back to you. For a moment, the world became quiet. He continued reading. Michael explained that after Daniel and Ranger were separated years earlier, the K-9 had not been forgotten. A retired military volunteer named Michael had helped care for Ranger while searching for a way to reconnect him with his former partner. But life moved differently than anyone expected. Time passed. Addresses changed. Records were updated. The path back became longer than anyone imagined. Yet Ranger remained the same. He waited. He remembered. He carried the harness. Daniel lowered the letter and looked at Ranger sitting beside him. The dog was watching his face carefully, as if he already knew what the words meant. Daniel sat down on the porch steps. The morning air was cold, but the sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. "You really were trying to find me all this time," Daniel whispered. Ranger slowly moved closer and rested his head against Daniel's knee. There was no dramatic moment, no loud celebration, just a quiet understanding between two souls that had spent years searching for the same place. Later that day, Daniel drove to Silver Creek Veterans Haven with Ranger beside him. He wanted Emily to read the letter too. When she finished, she looked toward the old K-9 and smiled softly. "He was never lost," she said. "He was just waiting." Those words stayed with Daniel, because for years, he had believed losing Ranger was another reminder of everything he could not protect. Another memory of things ending before he was ready. But maybe Ranger's journey was never about loss. Maybe it was about hope. That evening, Daniel took Ranger for a walk near the quiet trails outside town. The mountains stood tall in the distance, covered in snow and golden sunlight. The same mountains that once felt lonely now felt peaceful. Ranger walked slowly beside him, stopping every few minutes to look back and make sure Daniel was still there. It was a habit from another time, a small gesture from a loyal partner who never stopped watching over him. Daniel smiled. "You still do that, don't you?" he said. Ranger looked up at him. "Always making sure I am following." The dog's tail moved gently against the snow. As they continued walking, Daniel noticed something unusual near the edge of the trail. A small wooden box rested beneath an old pine tree. It was weathered from time, but it looked carefully placed. Daniel approached slowly and opened it. Inside were a few old photographs, a handwritten journal, and a small collection of memories connected to Ranger's years after they were separated. The journal belonged to Michael Lawson. Page after page told the story of a dog who refused to stop waiting. It described Ranger sleeping near the door every night, looking toward every passing vehicle, reacting whenever someone mentioned Daniel's name. The final page contained only one sentence. "A good soldier never leaves his partner behind, and a loyal dog never forgets the way home." Daniel closed the journal and held it carefully. The evening sky turned orange above the mountains. Ranger stood beside him, older now, slower than before, but still carrying the same heart. Daniel finally understood something he had spent years trying to learn. Some promises are not kept through grand gestures. Some are kept through patience, through waiting, through a quiet loyalty that survives even when nobody is watching. And as Daniel walked back home with Ranger beside him, he knew their story was not about the years they lost. It was about the years they still had left. The days that followed felt different for Daniel Whitmore, not because the world around him had changed, but because something inside him had finally become quiet. For years, every morning began with the same feeling, a small emptiness, a reminder of everything he had lost and every question that never received an answer. But now, when the morning light entered through the windows of his home in Silver Creek, there was another sound waiting for him. The gentle movement of paws across the wooden floor, the soft collar of a German shepherd moving through the hallway. Ranger was there, and somehow, that simple truth meant everything. Daniel began creating a new routine. Every morning, he poured his coffee, sat on the porch, and watched Ranger rest beneath the old maple tree in the yard. The dog was older now. He no longer moved with the endless energy of his younger years, but his spirit remained the same. His eyes still followed Daniel everywhere. His presence still carried the same quiet promise. One afternoon, Emily Carter visited with a small folder in her hands. She had been helping Daniel understand more about Ranger's journey, and she believed there were still pieces of the story waiting to be discovered. "There is something else you should know," Emily said as she sat across from him. Daniel looked at Ranger, who was resting near the fireplace. "What is it?" Emily opened the folder. Inside were several old documents from the military K-9 program. There were training records, photographs, and notes from people who had known Ranger before their lives changed forever. Daniel carefully looked through each page. He saw pictures of a younger Ranger standing proudly beside him. He saw moments he had almost forgotten. Training days, quiet moments between missions, times when the world felt simpler. Then Emily handed him one final document. It was a handwritten note from a former trainer. Daniel read the first sentence slowly. "Ranger has an unusual ability. He remembers people through trust, not just commands. Daniel paused. Those words stayed with him. Because that was exactly who Ranger had always been. The dog had never followed him because of training alone. He followed because of connection. Because somewhere along the way, they had become family. That evening, Daniel took Ranger to the quiet field behind the shelter. The sun was setting over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold. The air smelled like pine trees and fresh snow. Daniel walked slowly beside Ranger, matching his pace. Years ago, Daniel would have walked ahead, always focused on the next task, the next mission, the next responsibility. But now he understood something different. Sometimes the most important moments were the ones where you simply stayed beside someone. They reached an old wooden fence overlooking the valley. Daniel sat down and Ranger rested beside him. For several minutes, neither moved. They simply watched the sunset together. You know, Daniel said softly, I spent years thinking I had to find a way to fix the past. Ranger looked up at him. But maybe I just needed to accept that some things are returned when the time is right. A gentle wind moved through the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called across the valley. It was peaceful, almost like the world itself was reminding Daniel that healing did not always arrive with a loud moment. Sometimes it arrived quietly. Sometimes it arrived with four paws and a familiar pair of eyes. A few days later, Daniel received another visit from Thomas Reed, the retired Marine who had met Ranger at the shelter. Thomas brought an old military photograph he had found while helping organize veteran records. In the photograph was Daniel, Ranger, and another K-9 team standing together years earlier. On the back was a message written by Daniel himself. Partners until the end. Daniel smiled when he saw it. He had forgotten writing those words. But Ranger had not forgotten living them. Thomas looked at the dog resting beside Daniel. Some people spend their whole lives trying to prove they mattered, Thomas said. Maybe all they really needed was someone who remembered. Daniel looked down at Ranger. The old K-9 closed his eyes peacefully, his head resting near Daniel's boots. And in that moment, Daniel felt something he had not felt in many years. Not just happiness, not just relief, something deeper, gratitude. Because Ranger's return had given him more than a companion. It had given him the chance to forgive himself, to stop living only in memories of what was gone and begin appreciating what remained. But Daniel did not know that Ranger's journey still held one more surprise. One final connection from the past was waiting. A connection that would reveal why Ranger chose the veterans' shelter, why he arrived on that exact winter morning, and why some paths are guided by something we cannot always see. The first signs of spring arrived slowly in Silver Creek, Colorado. The snow that had covered the mountains for months began to soften beneath the warmer sunlight. Small streams of water moved through the fields, carrying pieces of winter away one quiet day at a time. For Daniel Whitmore, it felt like the world was learning how to breathe again. And beside him, Ranger was doing the same. The old German shepherd spent most mornings lying near the porch, watching the changing seasons with calm amber eyes. He was no longer the young K-9 who moved with endless energy. His steps were slower. His fur carried the memories of years gone by. But there was still a strength inside him that time could not touch. One morning, Daniel received a message from Silver Creek Veterans Haven. Emily Carter asked if he could come by. She had discovered something while reviewing old shelter records. Something connected to the exact day Ranger arrived. Daniel drove there with Ranger beside him, the familiar sound of the truck engine filling the quiet morning. When they arrived, Emily greeted them with a folder and a thoughtful expression. I found something strange, she said. Something that might explain why Ranger came here. Daniel looked at her carefully. What did you find? Emily opened the folder and placed an old photograph on the table. It showed the Veterans Haven shelter years earlier. The building looked almost the same, but one person in the picture caught Daniel's attention. An older man standing near the entrance with a gentle smile. Daniel recognized him immediately. His name was Robert Hayes. Robert had been a former Marine and a longtime volunteer at the shelter. He was known for helping veterans and animals who needed a second chance. Daniel remembered meeting him briefly years ago. Robert had always believed that every living soul deserved patience and kindness. Emily pointed to the photograph. Robert was the person who first helped Ranger after he arrived in Colorado. Daniel looked surprised. He knew Ranger? Emily nodded. Not just knew him. He cared for him. She explained that after Ranger had been found wandering, Robert spent months helping him recover and searching for information about his past. He noticed the old harness, the military training, and the name that connected Ranger to Daniel. But Robert never stopped believing the dog had a purpose. He kept records. He made notes. He waited for the right person to find him. Daniel looked down at Ranger. The dog was resting quietly beside his chair. He seemed peaceful, almost as if he remembered Robert too. Emily continued. Robert passed away last year. But before he left, he asked us to keep one thing safe. She reached into a drawer and removed a small wooden box. Inside was a handwritten journal. Daniel opened it carefully. The pages were filled with notes about Ranger. Not medical notes. Not training records. Personal memories. Robert wrote about the way Ranger would sit near the shelter entrance every evening. He wrote about how the dog always looked toward the road when vehicles passed. He wrote about how Ranger seemed to understand when veterans needed comfort. One sentence caught Daniel's attention. Some animals do not search for a place. They search for a person. Daniel stopped reading. The words felt heavier than the paper itself. He looked at Ranger and remembered all the years he spent believing he had lost his partner forever. But maybe Ranger had been carrying the same hope all along. Later that afternoon, Daniel walked through the shelter with Ranger beside him. Several veterans stopped to greet the old K-9. Some smiled. Some quietly placed a hand on his back. Everyone seemed to understand something special about him. Ranger had arrived as a lost dog. But he became something more. He became a reminder that nobody is forgotten. Outside the shelter, Daniel stood with Emily beneath the afternoon sky. Why do you think he came here? Daniel asked. Emily looked toward Ranger. Maybe because he knew this was where people understood waiting. Daniel looked at the old K-9. For years, he wondered why life had separated them. Why some connections seemed to disappear without explanation. But standing there, watching Ranger surrounded by people who cared about him, Daniel realized something. Sometimes a journey is not about getting back to where you started. Sometimes it is about finding all the people who help you survive along the way. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Ranger walked beside Daniel back toward the truck. But before they left, the old dog stopped near the shelter entrance and looked back one more time. It was a quiet goodbye. Hey, thank you to the place that kept him safe until he was ready to return home. And Daniel understood that Ranger's story was never only about a Marine and his K-9. It was about every person and every soul who needed someone to believe they were still worth finding. The weeks passed quietly in Silver Creek, Colorado, but something inside Daniel Whitmore continued to change. For so many years, he had believed that moving forward meant leaving things behind. The old photographs, the memories, the parts of himself connected to a life that felt too far away. But Ranger had shown him something different. Some things are not meant to be left behind. Some things are meant to be carried with gratitude. Every morning, Daniel and Ranger walked the same trail near the Veterans Haven shelter. It had become their place. The path was peaceful, surrounded by tall pine trees and open fields where the morning sunlight touched the grass. Ranger moved slowly now, but he never walked alone. Daniel matched every step. He no longer hurried. He no longer looked ahead searching for the next destination. He simply walked beside his oldest friend. One afternoon, Emily Carter called Daniel with unexpected news. A local community center was organizing a small gathering to honor veterans and the animals that helped them heal. She wanted Daniel and Ranger to attend. At first, Daniel hesitated. He had never been comfortable being the center of attention. For years, he preferred staying quiet. He believed some memories were meant to stay private. But Emily smiled and told him something simple. Sometimes sharing your story helps someone else believe in theirs. So Daniel agreed. The event took place on a clear spring morning. Veterans, families, and volunteers gathered outside the community center. There were tables with old photographs, handwritten stories, and memories from people whose lives had been changed by kindness. Ranger walked beside Daniel through the crowd. Many people stopped to meet him. They saw an older German shepherd wearing a familiar harness, but they did not know the journey behind those eyes. Daniel watched as veterans gently greeted Ranger. Some shared stories about their own service dogs. Others simply sat beside him in silence. They understood something without needing an explanation. Then Thomas Reed approached Daniel with a small smile. "There is someone here who wants to meet you," he said. Daniel turned and saw an elderly woman standing nearby. Her name was Margaret Lawson. She was the wife of Sergeant Michael Lawson, the man who had written the letter that helped Ranger return home. Daniel had never met her before. Margaret held a small envelope in her hands. My husband always believed Ranger would find you, she said. Daniel looked surprised. He believed that. She nodded. He told me that some bonds are stronger than distance. He said Ranger was not searching randomly. He was following a promise. She handed Daniel the envelope. Inside was a final note from Michael. The handwriting was familiar. The message was short. Daniel, if Ranger is standing beside you again, then the world gave both of you another chance. Take care of each other. That is all either of you ever needed. Daniel read the words slowly. He felt the familiar emotion rise inside him. But this time it was different. It was not sadness. It was appreciation. He looked down at Ranger, who was sitting calmly beside him. The old K-9 seemed peaceful, surrounded by the people who had helped him along the way. Later that evening, Daniel and Ranger returned home as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The sky was painted with soft shades of orange and purple. Daniel sat on the porch while Ranger rested near his feet. You know, Daniel said quietly, I used to think the hardest part was losing you. Ranger opened his eyes and looked at him. Daniel smiled. But maybe the hardest part was believing I could never find you again. The wind moved gently through the trees. The world felt still. Daniel realized that Ranger's return had not erased the years apart. Those years were part of their story. They showed patience. They showed loyalty. They showed that love can survive even when life takes unexpected turns. As the evening grew colder, Daniel placed a blanket near Ranger and sat beside him. The two stayed there together, watching the stars appear above. Silver Creek. A man who once felt lost. A dog who never stopped remembering. Two lives that found their way back to each other. But there was still one final morning ahead. One final moment that would show Daniel just how much Ranger had changed not only his life, but the lives of everyone who had crossed their path. The morning arrived quietly in Silver Creek, Colorado. A soft golden light moved across the mountains, touching the rooftops, the pine trees, and the small wooden porch where Daniel Whitmore sat with a cup of coffee in his hands. The air carried the fresh scent of spring, mixed with the familiar sounds of birds returning after a long winter. Beside him, Ranger rested peacefully. The old German shepherd's head was near Daniel's boots, his breathing slow and steady. For a moment, everything felt exactly as it should. No searching, no waiting, no unanswered questions, just peace. Daniel looked down at Ranger and smiled. You know, I never thought we would get another morning like this. Ranger lifted his eyes, the same amber eyes that had followed Daniel through years of memories, distance, and change. The dog could not answer with words, but he never needed to. His loyalty had always spoken louder than anything else. Over the months since Ranger returned, something beautiful had happened in Silver Creek. People began to know their story, not because Daniel wanted attention, not because Ranger was famous, but because their journey reminded others of something simple, that some connections are worth waiting for, that some promises are never truly forgotten. At Silver Creek Veterans Haven, Ranger became a familiar face. Veterans who arrived feeling alone often found comfort sitting beside him. Some shared stories they had never spoken before. Others simply sat quietly with him, allowing the calm presence of an old K-9 to remind them they were not alone. Emily Carter watched it all from a distance. She had helped countless people and animals over the years, but Ranger was different. He carried something she could not explain. He carried the memory of every person who had chosen kindness along his path. One afternoon, Daniel brought Ranger to the shelter. For their usual visit, the building was filled with warm voices and quiet laughter. A group of veterans gathered outside under the shade of the old trees. Ranger walked slowly among them, stopping whenever someone reached out a hand. He knew how to be present. That was always his gift. Thomas Reed watched from a nearby bench and smiled. Funny thing about that dog, he said. Daniel looked at him. What is that? Thomas looked toward Ranger. He came here needing someone to save him, but somehow he ended up saving everyone else. Daniel did not answer right away. He simply watched Ranger. The old K-9 was no longer the same dog from the photograph years ago. Time had changed him, but maybe time had also revealed who he truly was. Not just a military partner, not just a rescue story, a reminder that even after difficult seasons, life can still bring unexpected kindness. That evening, Daniel and Ranger walked home together beneath the fading sunlight. The road was quiet. The mountains stood in the distance. The same path that once represented loneliness now felt like a path toward gratitude. When they reached the porch, Ranger stopped and looked back toward the road. Daniel noticed the familiar gesture. The same habit Ranger had always carried. Watching, waiting, making sure no one was left behind. Daniel placed his hand gently on Ranger's head. "You spent all those years looking for me," he whispered. "I think you were reminding me to look for myself too." Ranger leaned closer. The moment was small, almost invisible to anyone passing by. But sometimes the most meaningful moments are the quiet ones. The ones that do not need an audience. The ones that stay in the heart long after they happen. Years later, people in Silver Creek would still remember the old German shepherd who walked through the snow with a name on his harness. They would remember the Marine who thought he had lost his closest partner forever. They would remember how one forgotten dog brought together veterans, strangers, and a community that learned the power of compassion. But Daniel remembered something even simpler. He remembered a cold morning, a shelter door opening, too familiar, eyes looking back at him, and the feeling that some miracles do not arrive with noise. Some miracles arrive quietly. Some miracles have 4 paws. And some promises are strong enough to find their way home.